All right, so today we're going to dive deep into the world of Bridgewater Associates
Okay.
through Rob Copeland's The Fund.
All
Now,
right.
you might be thinking, a book about a hedge fund sounds a bit, well, dry,
Mm-hmm.
but trust me, this isn't just your typical business story.
It's
I mean,
true. The fund pulls back the curtain on a place that's almost mythical in the finance world, and
yeah,
it's a deep dive into the company's culture, shaped by its founder, Ray Dalio, who's known for his unique and often controversial management philosophy.
exactly. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the book itself, let's set the stage a bit.
Okay.
What can you tell us about Rob Copeland, the author?
Well, Rob Copeland is a seasoned financial journalist. He's written for some big names, the Wall Street Journal, Fortune.
Hmm.
So he knows how to dig deep into complex financial topics and make them understandable for the rest of us who don't live and breathe Wall Street.
So he's the perfect guide to take us into this world.
Yeah.
What's the core of what he's trying to explore in the fund?
Yeah. The fund takes us on this journey exploring the rise of Bridgewater Associates and how it became this giant in the hedge fund world. And it really digs into the impact of Dalio's personality and his principles on shaping the firm's culture.
You mentioned principles.
Yeah.
I know Dalio wrote a whole book about his philosophy. Is Copeland's book kind of an extension of that?
In a way, yes. Dalio's principles is like a blueprint for his worldview, how he approaches decision-making relationships, even life in general.
Okay.
And the fund shows us those principles in action, how they played out in the real world of building and running a company.
Okay, that makes sense.
Hmm.
So it's more than just a typical business book. There's this human element to it, this look at how Dalio's philosophy impacted the people around him.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so fascinating. It raises questions about ambition power and the line between pushing for excellence and pushing people too far.
All right, so we've got this unconventional leader,
Yeah,
a company with a culture unlike any other,
right.
and a writer who knows how to tell a compelling story. Sounds like we're in for a wild ride.
We're Copeland starts right off the bat by introducing us to Paul McDowell, a senior executive brought in to help implement Dalio's ideas. And he paints this vivid picture of McDowell literally dry heaving in the snow after a tense phone call with Dalio.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah.
It sounds like Bridgewater was not for the faint of heart. What was it about Dalio that evoked such a strong reaction?
Well, Copeland describes Dalio's believability-weighted decision-making process.
Okay.
It's this idea that your influence within the company is tied to how believable you are, how much your colleagues trust your judgment.
Interesting.
McDowell, coming from a more traditional background, is both intrigued and completely thrown off by this whole system.
It's like his whole world is being turned upside down.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, is this kind of pressure cooker environment truly conducive to good work? Do people perform better under that level of scrutiny?
That's one of the big questions the book grapples with.
Yeah.
Another key concept introduced early on is Dalio's fascination with radical transparency. Think recording almost every meeting and making it accessible to everyone in the company.
Whoa. Talk about accountability, but seriously, imagine the pressure of knowing of every word and action is being analyzed. What kind of impact does that have on people?
It's a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, it could foster this intense level of honesty and openness, but it could also create a climate of fear where people are afraid to speak up or take risks.
Right.
Copeland really explores both sides of this.
It makes you think about the different ways people react to pressure and how much transparency is actually healthy in a work environment.
Yeah?
Now I'm curious about Dalio's background.
Okay.
What shaped him into the kind of leader he became?
Copeland gives us glimpses into Dalio's early life, his upbringing on Long Island, his fascination with the stock market as a kid, even getting fired from his first Wall Street job for punching his boss. You can see those early experiences shaping his worldview, his drive to do things differently.
He definitely seems like a guy who likes to challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
So what are some of the big questions Copeland explores in those early chapters?
One of the biggies is, how did Dalio's fascination with understanding the machine of the markets, the forces driving economic shifts, lead to the creation of Bridgewater?
Right. And how much of his success was driven by a genuine desire to understand those forces versus a desire for power and control?
Exactly. And there's also the question of whether his system, which relies so heavily on data and algorithms, can actually predict the future, or if it's just a sophisticated way of managing risk.
Also curious about those ethical questions we touched on earlier.
Yeah.
Does radical transparency cross the line into invasion of privacy?
Right.
And how do you balance the pursuit of truth with the need to treat people with respect and dignity?
Those are some of the big ethical knots the book tries to untangle.
Yeah.
It also makes you think about the role of personality and leadership. Was Dalio's success due to his unique approach? Or would Bridgewater have thrived under someone with a less intense, less controlling personality?
It feels like there's so many layers to this story. We've got the business side, the human side, the ethical side. It's all intertwined. Where do we go from here?
Well, in Chapter 1, Copeland dives into Dalio's childhood and early influences, giving us a better sense of the forces that shaped his worldview. It's this fascinating mix of his middle-class upbringing, his early success in the stock market, and his rebellious streak.
Sounds like the perfect foundation for a deep dive into the mind of Ray Dalio. I'm ready to go back to the beginning and see how it all started.
Okay, so Dalio's journey starts on Long Island. Not exactly the Wall Street we imagine, right?
Not quite.
Mm.
But even as a kid, Dalio was fascinated by the stock market.
Mm-hmm.
Copeland tells this great story about him buying his first stocks at 12, using money he earned as a golf caddy. Like he was a natural...
And it wasn't just luck. Dalio was obsessed with understanding the why behind market movements.
Yeah.
He even started an investment newsletter in high school, but his path wasn't without bumps. Remember how he got fired from that Wall Street job?
Yeah, for punching his boss.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild. It makes you wonder, was that a sign of things to come?
Right.
Did that experience fuel his desire to control his own destiny, to build something where he could call the shots?
That's a great question. It definitely seems like that early experience solidified his determination to do things his own way. And that ultimately led him to create Bridgewater.
Okay, so we've got this ambitious young Dalio, hungry to understand the markets and make his mark. What happens next?
Well, Chapter 2 takes us back to those early days of Bridgewater picture. This is Dalio working out of his two-bedroom apartment in New York City, landing his first major client, McDonald's, and starting to build his team. It's the classic startup story, but with a twist.
I bet knowing Dalio, it wasn't your typical work hard, play hard startup culture.
Not exactly from the beginning. He was already implementing his unconventional management ideas. This emphasis on radical transparency, like recording meetings and making them available to everyone, was there from the start.
Wow, imagine being one of those early employees. It's like walking into a social experiment. Do you think people were drawn to that kind of intensity, or were they just caught off guard?
Probably a bit of both. Copeland describes a mix of reactions. Some people were energized by the openness and the focus on meritocracy. Others were intimidated or even repelled by the constant feedback and scrutiny.
It's like Dalio was creating his own little world with its own set of rules, and those rules, those principles he lived by, eventually became the foundation for his book principles, right?
Exactly. It's fascinating to see how the seeds of those ideas were planted in those early days of Bridgewater.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, did Dalio set out to build a company that reflected his personal philosophy, or did the company's culture shape his thinking?
That's a great question. It's like a chicken and egg scenario.
Yeah.
So what were some of those early challenges Dalio faced in building Bridgewater?
Well, he had to convince clients to trust this young, unconventional firm with their money, and he had to build a team that could not only handle the intellectual rigor of the work, but also the intensity of the culture.
So not just finding brilliant minds, but finding people who could actually survive in that pressure cooker. It's like a whole different kind of recruitment challenge.
Absolutely. And then there's the challenge of scaling that culture as the firm grows.
Right.
How do you maintain that level of intensity and transparency when you're no longer a small, tight-knit team?
Right. It's one thing to have radical transparency with 10 people. This whole other ballgame when you've got hundreds or even thousands of employees.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the limits of Dalio's system. Can it actually work at scale?
That's a question Copeland keeps coming back to. Throughout the book now in Chapter 3, we see the creation of Bridgewater's flagship fund, Pure Alpha.
Okay.
This is where Dalio's quest to crack the code of the markets really takes off.
Okay, so this is where the big money starts rolling in.
Exactly. Pure Alpha was designed to generate returns regardless of market conditions.
Interesting.
And it was incredibly successful, solidifying Bridgewater's reputation and attracting a new wave of investors.
So what was the secret sauce? What made Pure Alpha so successful?
Well, it was a combination of Dalio's investment philosophy, his ability to identify and cultivate talent, and his relentless focus on data and analysis, but it was also shrouded in secrecy.
Interesting.
Even within Bridgewater, Pure Alpha was seen as this mysterious black box.
Interesting. That makes you wonder, was that secrecy intentional, a way to protect their edge? Or was it a sign of something else, maybe a lack of trust even within the company?
That's a good question. It definitely adds another layer of intrigue to the story, and it also raises questions about transparency. If Even the employees didn't fully understand how pure alpha worked. How could investors be sure they were making informed decisions?
Right. It's like they were being asked to trust the system blindly. So with the success of Pure Elf, Bridgewater is on the rise. What's the next big challenge?
Well, as the firm grows and attracts more attention, the pressure to maintain that level of success intensifies. And that's where things start to get really interesting because cracks start to appear in the seemingly perfect facade.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about these cracks. What starts to go wrong?
Well, in Chapter 4, we meet Greg Jensen, a brilliant but abrasive young man who becomes Dalio's right-hand man.
Okay.
He's instrumental in developing Bridgewater strategies, but he also embodies the firm's intense, sometimes cutthroat culture.
Ah, so the pressure cooker's starting to heat up.
Yeah.
I can already see this clash of personalities brewing. What kind of tension emerges between Dalio and Jensen?
Well, Jensen is described as fiercely independent and not afraid to challenge Dalio's authority.
Hmm.
This creates friction as Dalio is used to having his word be law.
It's that classic founder's dilemma. Again, it's hard to let go, especially when you've built something so successful and unique.
Exactly. And there's another layer of complexity here. Bridgewater's hiring process is incredibly rigorous, involving personality tests, cognitive assessments, and even lie detector tests.
Whoa, lie detector test. That's taking it to a whole new level. What was Dalio trying to achieve with such an intense vetting process?
He was obsessed with finding people who were not only intelligent, but also aligned with his principles. He wanted to build a team of like-minded individuals who shared his worldview.
It sounds like he was almost trying to create a cult of personality, surrounding himself with people who wouldn't question his methods.
That's a strong word, but there's definitely an element of that in the way he approached building Bridgewater.
Yeah.
And as the firm grows, that need for control, that fear of dissent becomes even more pronounced.
Okay, so we've got rising tension, a demanding culture, and a leader who's obsessed with control. Where do we go from here?
Well, Chapter 5 marks a pivotal moment. Dalio decides to formalize his management philosophy into a written document called the Principles.
Okay.
This is his attempt to codify his worldview, his beliefs about success, decision-making, and even life itself.
So it's not just a company handbook, it's like his personal manifesto.
Yeah.
But why did he feel the need to write it down? Was it just about preserving his legacy, or was there something more to it?
I think it was a combination of factors. He was facing challenges in scaling his management style as the firm grew. And he was starting to think about the future, about how Bridgewater could survive and thrive without him at the helm.
So the principles was a way to ensure his vision would endure, even if he wasn't there to enforce it personally.
Exactly. But there's also the sense that he genuinely believed his principles had broader applicability, that they could benefit other organizations and even individuals.
It's like he was on a mission to spread the gospel of Ray Dalio. But how did people react to the principles? Was everyone on board with his philosophy?
Copeland describes a mixed response. Some embraced it as a clear articulation of the values that had always guided Bridgewater. Others found it to be overly prescriptive, even cult-like.
So not exactly the universal acceptance he might have been hoping for. It makes you wonder how much of his philosophy was truly universal, and how much of it was just a reflection of his own personality and experiences.
That's a great question, and it's one that becomes even more relevant as we see how the principles play out in the real world, both within Bridgewater and beyond.
Yeah, so we've got this set of principles, this blueprint for success, and a company that's growing rapidly. What happens next?
Well, Chapter 6 focuses on the recruitment and integration of a new generation of talent at Bridgewater, particularly a young woman named Julia Stefanova.
Okay.
She's brilliant, ambitious, and quickly rises through the ranks, becoming a member of Dalio's inner circle.
Sounds like she was the perfect Bridgewater recruit, but we know this story isn't all sunshine and roses.
Right.
What challenges did she face?
Well, Stefanova was a strong and independent thinker, and she wasn't afraid to challenge Dalio's ideas or his authority.
Right.
This led to clashes as Dalio was used to having his views accepted without question.
It's that tension between the need for fresh perspectives and the founder's desire for control. It's a recurring theme in the book, isn't it?
It is, and Stefanova's story also highlights the challenges women can face in a male-dominated industry like finance. She had to constantly prove herself and work harder to be taken seriously.
Her experience adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of Bridgewater's culture.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about intellectual rigor, it was also about navigating power dynamics and gender biases.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the financial crisis of 2008. This was a pivotal moment for the entire world, and it had a profound impact on Bridgewater as well.
Okay, so how did Bridgewater, with its data-driven approach and unconventional culture fare during the crisis?
Surprisingly well, actually. Dalio had predicted the downturn. and position the firm to profit from it, this reinforced his belief in his own system and further cemented his authority within the company.
So it was a moment of vindication for Dalio.
Absolutely. But it also raised questions about whether his success was due to skill or luck.
Yeah.
Could he replicate that success in the future, or was it just a matter of time before his system failed?
Those are some big questions to grapple with. It seems like with every success, there's a shadow of doubt, a sense that things could unravel at any moment.
That's the tension that Copeland captures so brilliantly in the book. Now in Chapter 7, we have a fascinating character enter the scene. Jim Comey. Yes, that Jim Comey who would later become director of the FBI.
Wow, talking about a curveball. What was he doing at Bridgewater?
He joined as general counsel after serving as deputy attorney general under President George W. Bush. Comey, known for his integrity and commitment to the rule of law, brought a very different perspective to Bridgewater.
So he was the ultimate outsider.
Hmm.
How did he fit into this world of radical transparency and algorithmic management?
Not easily, as you might imagine. Copeland describes Comey as being both fascinated and appalled by what he observed.
Right.
He saw the potential benefits of transparency, but he also questioned the methods and the potential for abuse.
I can imagine coming from a legal background, he must have been particularly sensitive to those ethical questions around privacy and employee rights.
Absolutely, and his presence created this fascinating tension within the firm here. You have this highly principled individual who's used to operating within a traditional legal framework, trying to navigate this world that seems to operate according to its own set of rules.
Like two different worlds colliding. What was the outcome of that collision?
Well, Comey's time at Bridgewater was relatively short-lived. His disagreements with Dalio over the firm's culture and practices eventually led to his departure.
So even someone with Comey's stature and experience couldn't reconcile his own values with the demands of Bridgewater's culture.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, is there even room for dissent in this kind of environment?
That's one of the big questions the book grapples with. It also raises questions about whether a system that relies so heavily on a single individual like Dalio can be sustainable in the long term.
Right. What happens when the founder is no longer there to guide the ship?
Exactly. Now, Chapter 8 takes us even deeper into Bridgewater's use of technology and data analysis to manage employee performance and decision-making. This is where Dalio's obsession with systemization goes into overdrive.
Okay, so what kind of technologies are we talking about here?
Well, there's a system called Dot Collector, where employees could rate each other's performance in real time, and all that data was then aggregated and analyzed to make decisions about promotions, compensation, even terminations.
It sounds like the ultimate panopticon. Every move you make, every word you say, is being tracked and evaluated. How do people handle that level of scrutiny?
Some thrived in that environment. They saw it as a way to receive constant feedback and to identify areas for improvement, but others found it incredibly stressful and intrusive.
Right.
It created a culture of fear and paranoia where people were afraid to make mistakes or express dissenting opinions.
So it's that double-edged sword. Again, the same system that could drive excellence could also stifle creativity and innovation.
Exactly. And as the firm grows, that tension between control and creativity becomes even more pronounced now. Chapter 9 shifts our focus to Bob Prince Dalio's longtime partner and co-CIO. He's seen as a potential successor, but he also has his own ideas about how the firm should be run.
So the succession question is finally coming to the forefront. What happens with Prince? Does he manage to step into Dalio's shoes?
Well, it's not that simple. Prince eventually leaves Bridgewater, but he later returns in a different role.
Oh, right.
His departure highlights the challenges of succession planning in a firm with such a strong founder and a unique culture.
It makes you wonder, can Bridgewater even exist without Dalio at the helm? Is the firm's success so intertwined with his personality that it's impossible to replicate?
That's a question that hangs over the entire book, and as we move into Chapter 10, those questions become even more urgent.
Okay, what happens in Chapter 10?
It really is a book that makes you think. And that brings us to the final chapter where Copeland focuses on Dalio's decision to step back from the day-to-day running of Bridgewater and transition into more of a mentor and thought leader role.
This feels like a natural progression. After all, he had poured so much of himself into building this company and codifying his principles. What were the driving forces behind this decision?
Well, Dalio was in his 60s at this point, and it seems he felt he'd accomplished what he set out to do at Bridgewater. He had built a remarkably successful firm with a distinct and, let's face it, unusual culture.
You can't argue with his success, but I'm sure leaving a company you built from scratch is a difficult decision.
Definitely. But Dalio also believed that his principles had a broader application, that they could be beneficial to other organizations and individuals beyond the world of finance. So there was this desire to share his wisdom with a larger audience.
It's interesting how this ties back to the creation of principles earlier in the book. He was already laying the groundwork for this transition.
Exactly, and the book itself became a huge success, a bestseller praised for its insights and practical advice. But of course, it also drew criticism for being overly rigid and even a little cult-like in its tone.
It seems like Dalio, even in his attempt to step back and become a more broad-reaching thought leader, couldn't completely escape the controversy that had always surrounded him in Bridgewater.
That's true, but the book also sparked important conversations about leadership success and the future of work. It forced people to confront their own beliefs about what it takes to build a thriving organization.
And that's a valuable contribution in itself. So Dalio steps back, the book is published, and Bridgewater is left to navigate the future without its founder at the helm. What happens next? Does the company fall apart without its visionary leader?
Well, Copeland doesn't provide a neat resolution. Instead, he leaves us with this sense of open-endedness, a recognition that the story Bridgewater is still being written. He hints at both the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for the company as it tries to adapt to a changing world without its founder at the helm.
So it's a story without an ending, which is kind of fitting, don't you think?
I agree, it mirrors the reality of the business world. There's no finish line, no guarantee of success, just this constant need to adapt and evolve.
And maybe that's the biggest lesson we can take away from the fund. It's not a how-to guide for building the perfect company. It's a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most successful systems are flawed and that the human element will always be a factor.
Well said. And it's a reminder that transparency, even radical transparency, isn't always a simple solution. It can create as many problems as it solves. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It sounds like The Fund is a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it, prompting you to question your own beliefs about leadership success and the nature of work.
Absolutely. It's one of those books that makes you see the world a little differently, and it sparks conversations that are both thought-provoking and a little uncomfortable.
And sometimes those are the best kind of conversations.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into The Fund. It's been a fascinating and insightful journey.
My pleasure. It's always a pleasure to explore these complex and challenging ideas, and I hope our listeners will be inspired to pick up the book and continue the conversation.
I know I will. Until next time, keep diving deep. And remember, the most interesting stories are often the ones that don't have a neat and tidy ending.